Jasper Merritt slid the divorce papers across his desk without looking up. He kept his eyes on his laptop screen, on the quarterly projections he'd already reviewed 3 times that morning, because looking up was something you did when you were uncertain, and Jasper had not felt uncertain in a very long time. "I've had our lawyers outline a fair settlement," he said. "Sign where it's tabbed. Richard can drive you home." He heard Sabine move in the chair across from him. He heard the quiet rustle of paper. What he did not hear was what he expected: the soft intake of breath, the small collapse of someone receiving news they weren't prepared for. There was none of that. He didn't look up. He never saw her hands go very still above the papers. He never saw her read his name on the signature line, the way you read something you've been expecting for a long time. He never saw the expression that moved across her face, not grief, not anger, something quieter and more decided than either, before she folded the documents neatly and placed them in her bag. He never saw her smile on her way out. "Subscribe right now, and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from, because this man just made the most expensive mistake of his life." And he was still staring at his laptop when it began. The morning Jasper Merritt decided to end his marriage, Toronto was doing what it does in late September: cold sky, bright light, the lake sitting flat and gray at the end of every southward street. He'd woken up early. He'd gone for a run along the waterfront before 6. He'd come back feeling the way a man feels when he's finally decided something he's been circling for 2 years. Lighter, clear. He showered, dressed, made coffee. Sabine was already up. She was in the kitchen when he came downstairs, standing at the island with both hands around a mug, looking out the window at the backyard the way she always did in the morning. Quiet still, entirely herself. She was wearing a cream-colored cardigan he'd seen 100 times. Her hair was down. She hadn't put on earrings yet. For a fraction of a second, something moved through Jasper's chest that he couldn't name and didn't try to. "I need you at the office at 11, he said. "Downtown. Not here, take the car." He was already picking up his phone. Sabine turned from the window and looked at him. Her eyes were dark and calm. "All right," she said. "Just that. No question, no hesitation." He walked out the front door. She stood at the window a moment longer, watching the space where he'd been. Then she set down her coffee, went upstairs, and made the call she'd been ready to make for 7 months. Because Sabine Decker, the woman Jasper's colleagues called sweet, the woman his associates' wives described as unassuming, the woman he had married 9 years ago in a small ceremony on the Niagara Escarpment and quietly forgotten somewhere along the way, had known this morning was coming. She had not wasted a single day of those 7 months being unprepared. The offices of Beaumont Gagnon Legal occupied the 28th floor of a building on Bay Street, 4 blocks from Jasper's headquarters. Priscilla Beaumont had been Sabine's personal attorney for 8 years. She was 63, had argued cases before the Supreme Court of Canada, and kept a single framed photograph on her desk. Herself at 31, standing in front of the Palais Justice in Montreal in a suit that had cost her a month's salary. She had never replaced it. It was the day she won her first major case, and she saw no reason to pretend that something other than that was her beginning. When Sabine walked in that morning, Priscilla was already standing. She didn't offer condolences. She held out a chair and said, "Are you ready?" "Yes," Sabine said. She sat. She placed her bag on the floor. She folded her hands in her lap and said, without preamble, "He's going to offer a settlement, whatever the number is. I'm not taking it." Priscilla looked at her for a long moment. "Sabine, I know what you're going to say. Our team has valued the marital assets at somewhere between 60 and 90 million. A court would very likely award you." "Priscilla," Sabine said her lawyer's name, the way you say the name of someone you trust completely, quietly, without apology, with the full weight of a decision already made. "I don't want his money. What I want is a clean document. Nothing connecting my name to his. No claims, no settlement, no thread left between us." She paused. "He needs to believe he got out cleanly." Priscilla studied her face. It was the face of someone who had processed everything she needed to process, and was now simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. After a moment, she picked up her pen. Then let's make sure he believes exactly that. Jasper's boardroom on the 32nd floor of Merritt Group's headquarters was designed to communicate one thing: consequence. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides. A table long enough to seat 20. The kind of room where Jasper had closed 8-figure deals and watched competitors miscalculate. He'd chosen it for this meeting the way you choose a room when you want the other person to feel the weight of what they're giving up. He was already there when Sabine arrived, seated at the far end, with 2 lawyers flanking him, and Natasha Colville standing near the window in a navy blazer, holding a leather portfolio that had no real professional reason to be there. Natasha was Merritt Group's head of acquisitions. There was no legitimate basis for her presence at a private divorce proceeding. Jasper had invited her anyway, and he had told himself it was because she'd helped structure the settlement terms, which was technically accurate and almost entirely beside the point. Sabine entered with Priscilla beside her, and one other person, a quiet young man named Olivier, not Oliver, Olivier, with a deliberate French pronunciation, of someone whose name carried a specific weight, who carried a slim briefcase, said nothing during the entire proceeding, and whose business card, had anyone in that room thought to ask, read Senior Associate Willett Holdings Group. No one asked. Jasper looked at Sabine when she came in. He felt a brief, uncomfortable flicker of something he immediately suppressed. She looked different. She was wearing a dark charcoal dress he'd never seen. Simple, nothing theatrical. Her hair was pinned up. She looked like herself, completely, entirely like herself. And for some reason, that was the thing that gave half a second of doubt, which he covered immediately. Because Jasper Merritt covered things. He was very good at that. Sabine, he said, professional, even. Thank you for coming. She looked at him from across the table. Of course, she said. She sat without looking at Natasha. She did not look at Natasha once during the entire meeting. Not when Natasha shifted her weight. Not when Natasha uncapped her pen. Not when Natasha moved fractionally closer to the table as Jasper's lead attorney, a man named Theodore Garland, $800 an hour, with the particular disposition of someone who had witnessed too many dissolutions to feel anything about any of them, slid a portfolio across the polished surface. The settlement terms are in the second section, Theodore said. Mr. Merritt has been more than fair. 40% of liquid assets, the Rosedale property. No, thank you, Sabine said. The room went quiet in the specific way. Rooms go quiet when something unexpected has occurred. Theodore blinked. I beg your pardon? We're declining the settlement, Priscilla said, placing her own portfolio on the table and opening it with the unhurried precision of someone who had been looking forward to this particular moment for quite some time. My client is not requesting financial compensation from Mr. Merritt. No property, no assets, no structured arrangements of any kind. She paused. She'd simply like the divorce finalized. Clean mutual today if possible. Jasper stared at Sabine. Sabine! His voice had gone slightly wrong and he knew it. The Rosedale property alone is worth. I know what it's worth, she said. I don't want it. Something shifted in the room. Not dramatically, just a change in the air, the way pressure adjusts when a door opens somewhere you can't see. Theodore glanced at his junior. The junior studied her notepad. Natasha, near the window, was maintaining her expression with the careful effort of someone running several calculations simultaneously. Jasper looked at his ex-wife and felt, for the first time that morning, something that wasn't clarity. He did what men like him do. He pressed forward. If that's what you want, he said, hearing the stiffness in his own voice and despising it. Fine, let's proceed. He signed his name, 9 years of marriage reduced to ink on paper. Sabine picked up the pen. She signed slowly, deliberately, the way you sign something you've thought about for a long time. Not Sabine Decker. Sabine O'Ellette. The pen made a small, clean sound against the paper. She set it down and looked up at Jasper, and in her eyes was something he hadn't seen there in years. Not anger, not sadness, Not the quiet, patient hope she used to carry the way you carry something you're not certain anyone else can see. Something else entirely. Clarity, complete, unafraid, fully inhabited clarity. The floor tilted. Theodore was looking at the signature. His voice, when he spoke, was very carefully empty of expression. Ouellette, he said. Sabine Ouellette. That's correct, Priscilla said pleasantly. The room was quiet. Jasper said, What does that mean? No one answered immediately. Olivier closed his briefcase with a soft click, rose, looked at Priscilla, who nodded once, and walked out of the boardroom without a word. In the hallway, he took out his phone and made a call. That call lasted 53 seconds. It would cost Jasper Merritt $41 million before the week was out. But he didn't know that yet. He was still in the boardroom, staring at his ex-wife's name, trying to remember if he'd ever heard the word Ouellette spoken in her presence, trying to go back through 9 years of dinners and arguments and quiet, Saturday mornings and company events, to find some moment where she might have let something slip. He found nothing because Sabine had been very, very careful. You need to understand what Jasper never did. You need to understand the kind of woman who had been sitting beside him for nearly a decade. The Ouellette family was not a name you saw in print. That was the point. They were not on magazine covers. They didn't attend the galas other old money families used to signal their continued relevance. They were the kind of wealth that is so old and so deliberately quiet that people who know about it speak of it the way you speak of bedrock, not as people, as ground. Ouellette Holdings Group controlled significant stakes in forestry, energy infrastructure, and industrial manufacturing across Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia. 7 other names that shared no visible connection to the family. Combined, the portfolio was estimated by the 3 people in the world with access to the full picture at somewhere north of $40 billion. Sabine was the only child of Wallace Ouellette, 71 years old, white-haired, who lived in a house in Quebec's eastern townships that appeared on no real estate listing, and who had agreed to his daughter's decision to live privately on one condition, that she always have Priscilla's number in her phone. Sabine had met Jasper when she was 27, and he was 29. She'd been using her middle name, paired with her mother's maiden name, Decker. She hadn't told anyone who she was, not because she was ashamed, because she had spent her entire life watching people perform for the Ouellette name, and she had wanted, just once, to be known for the actual person she was. She thought she'd found that with Jasper. For 5 years, she was certain she had. The 6th year was when things began to change. She could trace it if she tried. The first major project win, the first profile piece in a national business magazine, the first gala where a woman looked at him, and then at Sabine, and then back at him, with an expression that asked plainly what the equation was. She watched him shift the way you watch a river change course, gradually, then all at once. She kept finding reasons: the pace of the company's growth, the pressure of the lakeshore development, the contractor lawsuit. She told herself the man who'd once read her his business plans out loud at midnight, sprawled across their first apartment floor with a bottle of wine between them, was still in there somewhere, buried under all that success. The night of his company's 7th anniversary gala was the night. She stopped telling herself that. She'd worn a dress she loved, burgundy, simple, with her grandmother's bracelet. She'd thought, and she wasn't someone who spent much time thinking about such things, that she looked like herself. Jasper looked at her at the top of the stairs and said, "Is that what you're wearing tonight?" Not cruelly, dismissively, already elsewhere in his head. She went back upstairs and changed into something that didn't feel like her. At the gala, she stood near the back of the room, with a glass of sparkling water she didn't drink, and she watched her husband work the crowd with Natasha Colville at his elbow. She noticed, really noticed, for the first time, that Jasper moved differently when Natasha was nearby, more energized, funnier. He tilted his head when she spoke, and gave her the full weight of his attention, the same way he used to give Sabine the full weight of his attention in their first apartment, when they had nothing but each other, and that had somehow been enough. Sabine left early. She took a cab home. She sat at the kitchen table in the dark and called her father. Bonsoir, ma fille, he said. He always called her that, even at 36. She told him the truth. She hadn't done that in a long time. She was stubborn and private and had not wanted to become someone who needed saving. But that night she was tired, and she told him everything. When she was done, there was a long silence on the line. Tu sais que tu n'es pas obligé de rester, he said quietly. You know you don't have to stay. I know. I never asked you to prove anything to me. I know that too. A pause. Outside the kitchen window, the backyard was dark. The lilac, along the fence, the raised herb bed she'd built one weekend when Jasper was in Vancouver, the yard she'd made into something because she needed something that was hers. What do you need then? Her father asked. She thought about it for a long time. 7 months, she finally said. I need 7 months. She spent those 7 months doing something Jasper would not have recognized. Not grieving, working. Quietly and methodically, creating a clean financial separation between every invisible thread that connected her to his company's survival. Because the threads existed. She had never told him, but they existed. The Ouellet name, even unspoken, even unknown, carries weight in certain rooms. Sabine had used that weight twice in 9 years. Once, in the beginning, when a consortium of Quebec investors was about to decline Merritt Group's financing application. She had made one quiet call, and the application had not been declined. Once 3 years later, when a competitor tried to freeze Jasper out of a key land acquisition in Mississauga, and found that the relevant doors were mysteriously, stubbornly closed. Jasper had never known why either of those things had worked in his favor. He had attributed both to his own strategy. Sabine had not corrected him. Now she spent 7 months making sure that when she stepped back cleanly, so that whatever happened next would be the result of nothing but Jasper's own decisions. No lingering protection, no invisible shield. Just him, alone in the empire, he believed he had built entirely by himself. She didn't hate him for any of it. That was the thing people would struggle to understand later, when the story became public. She wasn't angry. She was grieving. And there is a difference, and it matters. Anger is loud and forward-moving. Grief is the weight of something that was real and is now finished, of choosing the version of yourself that tells the truth over the version that goes on pretending. She was grieving the man she'd fallen in love with at 27, because that man was gone. What sat across the gala room from her, tilting toward Natasha Colville, was a very successful stranger wearing his face. She couldn't stay married to a stranger, just because she remembered the person he used to be. So when he slid the papers across his desk that September morning, she didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She picked up the pen and signed her real name and walked out of his building into the thin autumn light and called her father and said, "C'est fait." And Wallace Ouellet, who had been by his phone since 8 o'clock, with the patience of a man who has spent 7 decades understanding that the most important things always take longer than you want them to, said very softly, "Bien. Viens à la maison, ma fille. On a du travail. Come home, we have work to do." Back in the boardroom, Jasper was still staring at the papers. Theodore had pulled out his phone. He was looking at the result with an expression Jasper had never seen on that particular face, and Theodore Garland was not a man who wore new expressions. He'd sat through fraud cases and corporate collapses with the same steady blankness of someone who had cataloged human disaster into a limited number of recognizable shapes. This shape was new. "Jasper," Theodore said. His voice had changed. "I think we need to step out." "Tell me here." Theodore looked at his phone again. He said very carefully, "Ouellet Holdings Group is the largest private industrial conglomerate in Quebec and one of the top 10 private capital entities in Canada by asset value." He stopped. He pressed his lips together. "According to what I'm seeing, Sabine Ouellet is listed as the sole heir of Wallace Ouellet." The boardroom was quiet. Natasha had moved away from the window. She was near the door now. "That's not possible," Jasper said. "I'm looking at it." She would have told me. He heard his own voice. In 9 years, she would have said something. Apparently, Theodore said with enormous care, she did not. Jasper pushed his chair back. He walked to the window. He stood there, looking at the financial district below, at the city he'd spent a decade making his name in. His reflection looked back from the glass, composed, polished, successful. And underneath all of it, he felt the particular vertigo of a man who has just discovered that the foundation of everything he thought he'd built is not exactly what he believed it was. Not fraud, not deception, something more complicated and more painful than either of those things. The discovery that someone had loved him completely, and that he had been so absorbed in becoming someone that he had simply never looked. His phone buzzed, then again. His work line started ringing. He turned. Theodore was looking at his screen with an expression that had moved past careful into something closer to alarmed. The Saint Laurent project, Theodore said. The Quebec financing partners. He stopped, restarted. They're withdrawing, all three, simultaneously. Jasper grabbed his phone. Notifications were flooding in. Messages from his project managers, his investor relations lead, his legal department, the 2 institutional partners whose combined stake represented 38% of Merritt Group's current valuation. The share price had already started moving downward, sharply. He looked at the papers on the table, his signature, her signature, already filed, already processed, already permanent. He said, to no one in particular, to the room, to the September morning that had begun with him feeling lighter than he had in years. What is happening to my company? No one answered, but the answer was already obvious to everyone present. The woman who had spent 9 years quietly, holding a shield between Jasper Merritt and the full weight of a world that owed her family more goodwill than he could count, had simply picked up that shield and walked away. She hadn't attacked him. She hadn't retaliated. She had done something far more definitive than either of those things. She had stopped protecting him. The stock moved another 6% before noon. By 3 o'clock, a journalist named Sandra Aiken at a national business publication had connected enough dots to post a story. Her headline read, "Who is Sabine Uwelde and what did Jasper Merritt just lose?" He read it in his car. He read it twice, then once more. She had traced the timeline. She had found the filing. She had spoken to sources described as people familiar with the Ouellet family's investment philosophy, and what they'd told her was accurate in ways that Jasper's own team had not managed to determine in 6 hours of trying. The piece did not describe Sabine as a wronged wife. It did not frame it as a revenge story. It described her as what she was. A woman who had made a deliberate choice to live under her own terms, who had brought that same deliberateness to her marriage, and who was now, by all available evidence, stepping back into the life she'd set aside and preparing to do something significant in it. The final paragraph noted that Ouellet Holdings Group had confirmed the appointment of Sabine Ouellet as executive director of a new division, Ouellet Ventures, focused on technology-enabled infrastructure. Several former executives from leading Canadian and American firms had already joined quietly. The industry, the piece concluded, was beginning to pay attention. Jasper read that last paragraph 4 times. 3 days later, she called him. He answered on the first ring. Sabine. Her name in his mouth felt like something he hadn't said correctly in a long time. Jasper, she said. Her voice was the same. That was the first thing he noticed. The same voice, the same measured cadence, and something in the sameness of it landed in his chest in a way he wasn't prepared for. He'd prepared what to say. He'd thought about this call for 72 hours. He opened his mouth to deliver the first thing on his list, and what came out instead was, "I'm sorry." A silence, 2 seconds, 3. "Okay," she said quietly, not accepting it, not refusing it, just acknowledging that he'd said it. "I didn't know," he said. "About your family, about who?" "I know you didn't know," she said. That was the point. He stopped. He had not thought about it that way. He'd been thinking about it as a gap in his information. A revelation that changed the context of everything. He had not been thinking about the fact that she had chosen not to tell him, which meant she had wanted to be loved without it. Which meant she had been hoping for something specific from him, and he had failed to provide it so completely, and for so long that she had spent 9 years revising that hope downward until there was nothing left to revise. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. He heard how inadequate the question was the moment it left his mouth. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was not cold. It was the voice of someone who has fully felt something and processed it, and now has access only to the truth of it. "Because I wanted to know if you'd see me," she said, "without any of it, just me, the actual person." A pause. "For a long time you did, and then you didn't. And by the time you'd stopped seeing me, it had nothing to do with what you didn't know about my family. It had to do with who you'd decided to become." He said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. "I'm not calling to make things worse," she said. "I know what's happening with the company. I know what these last few days have been." "Then you know why I reached out." "Yes." Another pause. "My father made some calls. He was protecting what had always been his family's. I didn't ask him to, and I didn't stop him. But Jasper, those relationships, that goodwill, it was never something you earned. It existed because I existed, and because certain people in certain rooms knew who I was, even when you didn't. When I left, that changed. That's not an attack, that's just reality adjusting to the truth." He stood in the hallway of his own building and held the phone, and felt the full weight of what she had just said. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked. "Build it yourself this time," she said. Not unkindly, not triumphantly. In the simple, direct tone of someone telling you something true because they believe you're capable of hearing it. "The company is real. The work is real. You're genuinely good at what you do. You always were. Build from that. Stop relying on things you didn't earn." He was quiet for a long time. "That's the most generous thing you could say to me right now," he finally said. "Do you know that?" "Yes," she said, "I do." The call lasted a few more minutes, practical things. Nothing about the marriage, nothing about what had been lost. When it ended, he stood in the hallway for a long time. Then he went back to work. The board meeting happened 2 weeks later, 12 people on the call. Jasper was honest in a way he had not been honest with a boardroom in 3 years. About the vulnerability, about the fact that certain relationships would have to be rebuilt from scratch without the advantages he'd previously relied upon. He introduced new leadership in 2 divisions. He answered every question directly. He didn't perform resilience. He told them the truth. The vote to continue under his leadership was 7-2. It was enough. In the eastern townships, in the house that appeared on no listing, Sabine sat across from her father at a long table. She had a cup of tea that had gone cold. She hadn't noticed. "The directive was necessary," Wallace said. He was looking at a document, his reading glasses low on his nose. "I know. Those relationships were extended informally because of you. They were never his to keep." "I know, Papa." She wrapped both hands around her cold cup. "I just didn't want him destroyed." He looked up at her over his glasses. His eyes were the same dark color as hers. In his expression, if you knew how to read it, and Sabine did, she'd been reading it her whole life, was something that wasn't quite sadness, but lived in the same neighborhood. The expression of a man who loves his child completely, and has watched her spend 9 years pouring that love into someone who weighed it and found it insufficient. "Then let's get to work," he said quietly. He turned the page. She opened her laptop. She pulled up the file she'd been building for 7 months, and she got to work. The Wellet Ventures announcement came on a Wednesday morning, 11 weeks after the divorce, at a private presentation in Montreal. Sabine stood at the front of the room without notes, in a dark green blazer, with the particular composure of someone who doesn't need to perform confidence, because confidence is simply what she has. She spoke for 38 minutes about what they were building and why. About the relationship between invisibility and capability. About what it means to work without recognition long enough to understand what the work actually is. She spoke in the grounded, specific language of infrastructure and technology, and underneath that language was a personal truth so precisely expressed that several people in the room felt something shift in their chests without fully understanding why. Jasper watched the live stream from his office. Door closed, calls held, all 48 minutes of it alone. He watched his ex-wife present something that was, by any honest measure, more sophisticated and more carefully considered than anything Merritt Group had built in its best year. And he felt something he had to sit with before he could name it. Pride, not the kind that belongs to you, the kind that belongs to someone else. That you feel anyway, because you knew them before the world did. Knowing them before the world did is the thing you carry longest. He felt proud of her, and underneath that, the full quiet weight of understanding what that meant. That he had been close enough to something extraordinary to feel proud of it, and he had spent 9 years too absorbed in performing himself to see it clearly. Paul Eddington, his VP of Operations, knocked and opened the door. He looked at the screen. He looked at Jasper. He closed the door again without saying anything, because Paul understood when silence was the correct response. Jasper turned off the stream. He sat with his hands on his desk and looked at nothing, and he let himself feel what he felt without compressing it into something more useful. Then he picked up his restructuring plan and got back to work. Because that was what was left, and he was good at it, and being good at it was going to have to be enough. In the months that followed, Merritt Group contracted, stabilized, and began to grow again from a smaller, more honest foundation. The foundation was harder. There was no invisible advantage behind it. There was just the work. And the work was real. It had always been real. Jasper had built something genuine in those early years, before he'd confused the act of building with the proof of who he was. Underneath all the performance, underneath the gala rooms and the magazine profiles, and the accumulated weight of someone else's reflected approval, the thing itself had held. He was finding his way back to it. Sabine heard about the board vote. She called, 6 months after the divorce, on a Thursday evening. "I heard it was 7-2, she said. "It was." A pause. "How are you?" He thought about the answer he would have given 6 months ago. Fine, moving forward, managing. He thought about what she'd told him, about building from what was actually real. "Getting there," he said slowly. "That's the right pace," she said, "for what you're doing." "Is that a professional observation?" A pause, and then small and real. "No, it's a personal one." He held that. He didn't push it further. He had learned, in the previous 6 months, that there were things sitting with rather than pressing. They spoke for 20 minutes. Industry things, ordinary things, the kind of conversation that accumulates between two people who are no longer sharing a life but haven't stopped existing in each other's awareness. When it ended, he sat with his phone in his hand for a long time. He thought about what she'd said. He thought about all the distance between who he'd been and who he was becoming. He thought about the fact that even a very long distance, if you've been traveling honestly, is not the same thing as being lost. He put his phone down. He opened his laptop. He had work to do entirely his, built on nothing but what he was and what he was still day by day learning to see. And somewhere in Quebec, in the house surrounded by October trees, Sabine Ouellette closed her laptop at the end of a long day and looked out the window at the dark that had gathered quietly around the lights. She thought about what she'd built. She thought about what she'd hoped for once and what she'd chosen to become instead. She thought, "This is mine." And she thought with the quiet, honest complexity of someone who has learned the hard way that love and ambition are not opposites, that they are sometimes the same impulse, wearing different clothes. I wish he had seen how I got here. Not because she needed him to have seen it. She had done this without him. She was doing it without him. She was going to keep doing it without him because the work was real, and it was hers, and it didn't require his presence to mean something. But wishing was not the same as needing. And she was finally, fully in a place where she knew the difference. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be seen. Sabine Ouet built something lasting in the time it took the wrong person to learn how to look. And that is the truest thing about her story. Not the inheritance, not the empire, not the $41 million that walked out of his future the morning he signed his name without looking up. The truest thing is this. She never needed his recognition to know what she was worth. She just needed finally to stop spending her energy on someone who had forgotten how to see her.